Hello and welcome to Library Drawing Party. Today we're going to be drawing this beautiful sunflower. To get started, we're going to be applying a watercolor base. And let's start with the center of our sunflower. So for the center, we're going to take some brown There was already a little bit of blue on my palette, so I'm going to leave that and it'll add a bit of a darker tone. Then take some orange. And a tiny bit of yellow. And a bit more brown. And a bit more orange. We kind of want like a terracotta color. This is the color I mixed. Now I'm going to take my big brush. I'm going to paint a circle. It's a pretty big circle because sunflowers have a pretty big center. Now while I still have some brown on my brush, I'm going to add brown to another section in my watercolor palette. And then I'm going to take green. And mix that up to get like a foresty green. And I'm going to use that for my leaves. We have the main stem, and there's some connecting pieces, and there's this leaf is in shadow. And there's another leaf in shadow down here. We don't want to paint all of the leaves just yet because we do want to add some highlights, which I'll be using with a lighter green, which I'm going to actually mix right now. I'm going to use that same foresty green, and I'm going to put some extra green and some extra yellow. A lot of water to make this lighter green, which I'm going to use for the highlights. I'm going to paint that right over. We don't want to use just the plain green, because we want to make sure we're getting some of that brown into the leaves, because they're not going to be just true green. You can take some highlights of yellow. This will help tie in the yellow of the sunflower. You can take some green and use that as highlights. But see how this green It's almost like an emerald green. We want to stay more with this foresty tone. Okay, we're going to be layering colors as we go along, so we can leave it like that for now. I'm going to take my tissue and clean up some of the excess. I'll actually use that green in the center. It'll help give it some nice shadow as we layer and help tie the colors together. You want to clean your brush really well for the yellow. You want to make sure that if you got any green on the yellow that you remove it or paint it onto another sheet of paper first. I'm still using my big brush for the petals because I'm just going in lines. You can make them as thick or as thin as you want. It all just depends on the way that you move the brush. And it's okay if some of the paint goes in the center. What's great about the center of the sunflower is that it's a darker color, so we can paint right over it with no problems. Our sunflower is still wet. I'm going to take my yellow watercolor pencil and draw in some lines for the petals. This will help give it some texture and some extra pigment to really help bring out that yellow color. I'm doing this while it's still wet so the pencil blends into the watercolor. If you have just regular colored pencils at home, you can wait until your watercolor has dried and then apply colored pencils as necessary. So it'll just help brighten everything up a bit. Okay, at this point I want to take my smaller brush and I'm going to use some orange for highlights and texture. So I'm going to be using, and if you get too much paint on your brush, you can just add it to the center because that's going to be brown and orange anyway. But you want to have a dry brush so you can add in those lines. You want to see the brush strokes. And it's darker at the bottom of the sunflower because our light source is coming from above. And then take some more yellow and layer that on top as well. Every flower in nature is going to be a little bit different. So if your sunflower looks different than mine, that's perfectly normal. Now I'm just taking my yellow and filling in some of these spaces. We don't want to fill in all the spaces, but this will help layer the sunflower to show that there's petals on top of petals on top of petals, and it's not one-dimensional. That's the real beauty of this flower, is all of the layers that go into it. Alright, I'm gonna use some more orange for some highlight, or for some shadow. You want to carry some of the orange out to the edges. This will give shadow to the individual petals. We don't want it to be too uniform. We're doing almost an impressionist style painting, where it's more focused on the colors and the textures than it is on the realism. Alright, I'm going to take some brown. I'm going to work on the center again. You want to really make sure that this is a circle and not like a square. And if you find you're having square edges, you can round them out with some yellow. You can also add some highlights with some water. Alright, now I want the sunflower to dry a little bit because we're going to add layers on top once it's a bit dry. So while it's drying, I'm going to take my blue and I'm going to mix it with some gray and a bit of purple. Purple will be a nice contrast to the yellow since they're complementary colors. This will make almost an indigo color. Then I'm going to take some water to thin it out. This is the color that I mixed. I'm going to use that for my background. I'm going to start in between the leaves, as this is going to be the darkest part. This is looking a little bit too much of a night sky for me, so I'm going to add in some water and use the pigment I used there to add in some color by the sunflowers. And if it's looking a bit gray, you can add in some pure blue. Help bring out those bright, vibrant tones. You can even mix some of the blue in between petals. And since this is supposed to be the sky, it doesn't have to be uniform. Some parts can be lighter, some parts can be darker. I'm going to use some of this blue for the shadow. It's a good idea to keep an eye on your water. If your water is starting to look dirty like mine is, you might want to change it out. I'm going to use my big brush to apply a second coat of yellow to my petals. This will give it more texture, more brightness. I'm going to take my brown. I'm going to mix some more of the center color. I'm going to use some orange. You can even use a bit of red. Alright, this is a color I mixed, and I'm going to use that in the center. So we want to deepen the color. You really want your eye to be drawn to the center of the sunflower. I use some of the brown for some texture in my leaves. And a bit of shading for underneath my flower. I'm going to take my brown pencil, really emphasize the circle, and then I'm going to add in some texture with some lines. If you're doing this with regular colored pencils at home, you're going to want to wait until this is dried. I'm using my watercolor pencils so I can apply it on wet paper. I'm going to add in some more yellow, especially towards the top of the sunflower. And take some of the blue and add in some more shading. Add in a bit more orange. Bit more yellow. I think the hardest part about some paintings is knowing when to stop. It's easy to overwork them. You don't want to lose the texture that you worked so hard to create. I'm going to work on my leaves again. So I'm going to take some of that green that we started with and I'm going to mix that brown in a bit more. I want to mix it all in because I want to keep some of that texture, but enough. I also want to lighten the background a bit. You can also use a tissue for this. You can use a tissue to add some highlights into your sunflower. I'm going to use brown. I'm going to define a couple of petals. I don't want to define all of the petals. I want to define some. This will help give some shape to all the colors that we added. Particularly in the bottom. I'm going to use my yellow to define some of the petals above. And keep everything from getting too muddled. Use my smaller brush and add a final layer of pure yellow. This can smooth out some of the lines of the petals without losing too much texture. Some pops of orange. you have it. That's our sunflower. Thank you for joining us in this week's library drawing party. We hope to see you again next week. We have library drawing parties every Wednesday at 7 p.m. And keep being creative.